So welcome everyone to our March meeting. I'm very pleased that Raúl Navas Moreno has accepted my invitation to talk. I met him in 2022 in Barcelona when he was still preparing his master's thesis, and he already impressed me then. His master's thesis had the title, I translate into English, the Perses of the Frataraka during Seleukid rule, political status, administration of the territory. So he has since then developed further research going all the way up and down in time to investigate the Seleukid Empire with a focus on the Perses, with looking back onto the Achaimenid and looking forth onto the Parthians and the Sasanians. And that is also the concentration of his presentation today. He is now speaking to us as a PhD student at the Autonomous University. The title of his PhD is The Seleukid Empire and the Iranian World, Sources on Interaction, Continuity, and Change in Hellenistic Near East. His supervisor is Professor Agosti, and I am very impressed that there are still universities in this world where a student in ancient history also has the opportunity to learn Akkadian and Old Persian, Middle Persian, and no need to mention Greek and Latin. So we are very grateful to have you share your PhD studies with us, Raúl, and I will introduce the respondent, Dr. David Engels, after your talk. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share the presentation. Okay, I think you should see the slides now.
We do.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank you for kindly inviting me to give this lecture. In this presentation, I will address one of the central themes of my research, the scholarly debate on continuity and change in pre-Islamic Iran, and the role of the Seleucid dynasty in the succession of Iranian empires, following the Achaimenid and preceding the Arsakids and Sasanians. First, I will delve into the Achaimenid influence on the Seleucid dynasty, evaluating the extent to which it was significant. I will then analyze the impact of the Seleucids on the Arsakid and Sasanian empires, and ultimately, this study aims to provide a deeper understanding of the Seleucid dynasty's role in pre-Islamic history. I will argue that the Seleucid presence in Iran was both spatially and temporally limited, with their rule being largely indirect. Moreover, I will contend that while Achaemenid influence was not particularly strong, the Seleucids had a significant impact on the Arsakid and Sasanian dynasties. This research faces two major challenges. First, the nature of ancient sources. Classical authors often show little interest in Hellenistic Iran or treat it marginally. And additionally, narratives frequently display a pro-Roman and anti-Seleucid bias, alongside a broader pro-Greek and anti-barbarian perspective. Second, modern scholarship has been shaped by disciplinary boundaries. Historians tend to adopt a Hellenocentric perspective, while Iranian and Assyriological scholars may emphasize Eastern elements. Generally multicultural nature of the Seleucid Empire requires a multidisciplinary approach, often hindered by these divisions. In addition, archaeological excavations have tended to prioritize Roman and Byzantine layers over Seleucid strata. The ideological significance of the Achaemenid and Sasanian past for modern Iran has also contributed to a negative perception of Greco-Macedonian rule. Another difficulty arises from the relatively limited scholarly attention devoted to the Seleucids compared to other fields of study. Like I said. Moreover, in general, this research is based on the analysis of Greco-Roman classical and epigraphic sources, cuneiform documentation, Achaemenid royal inscriptions, as well as Middle Persian inscriptions and Pahlavi and classical Persian literature. Additionally, I have employed geographical information systems to create maps that illustrate the territorial distribution of Seleucid settlements. Although my research seeks to explore an understudied area within academic scholarship, it builds upon the foundational work of prominent scholars who have made significant contributions to the field. Even when my conclusions may differ from theirs, I fully acknowledge the importance of their research as the basis for my own study. Here is a brief list of some of the key works that have inspired my research. This is a simple and a brief compilation of articles and books that I believe are particularly significant. However, I have, of course, left out many other important works as this list is not systematic. The first point I would like to address is the Greco-Macedonian presence in Hellenistic Iran. Alexander's conquest and the establishment of the Seleucid Empire brought substantial changes to the territorial structure of the Near East. Power shifted into the hands of Greco-Macedonians rather than Iranians or Mesopotamians, as had been the case for the previous 3 millennia, and the political center of gravity moved westward. This, combined with the vast expanse of the newly formed empire, required indirect rule over the eastern territories. In this context, Greco-Macedonian cities served as the primary centers of direct control exercised by the Seleucid dynasty. To consolidate their rule, the Seleucids established numerous colonial foundations, and although these were primarily concentrated in Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia, some were also founded in Iranian territories. This passage from Appian is clearly representative of the founding activity of the early Seleucid monarchs, particularly Seleucus I. The author states that Seleucus founded 16 Antiochs, 5 Laodiceas, 9 bearing his own name, 4 named after his wives, 3 called Apamias, and 1 Statonicea. He then gives the names of other foundations with non-dynastic names, such as Beroea, Edessa, and so on. In certain cases, they simply reestablish pre-existing cities by assigning them a new name, typically of dynastic origin, and settling a Greco-Macedonian community or a military garrison. A clear example of this is this Akkadian text, which refers to the establishment of a Greco-Macedonian community in Babylon. It says, the Greek, as they are called the Politai, in Akkadian is Politanu, who in the past, at the command of King Antiochus, had entered Babylon, wherever. In this map, you can see the various cities with Greco-Macedonian presence or connections documented during the Hellenistic period in Iranian territories. While there are quite a few cities, it's important to note that many of them would have gained independence at an early date, becoming part of the kingdoms of Bactria and Parthia. Additionally, we also identify a significant number of settlements located in the western and northwestern region of Media, near Mesopotamia. In much of the Iranian plateau, which is rather inhospitable, there are scarcely any documented settlement. Here is a list of documented settlements whose location is uncertain or whose identification with another settlement is dubious. And here is a list of documented settlements whose location is completely unknown or highly speculative. This compilation aims to demonstrate that Although the Seleucids concentrated many of their colonial foundations in other regions, Iran also underwent this phenomenon, despite occasionally attracting limited interest. Seleucid colonization becomes particularly significant when considering that the colonies, along with their Greco-Macedonian populations, served as the principal agents of territorial control across the empire. Moreover, the inherent difficulties of maintaining cohesion within such a vast and culturally diverse empire forced the Seleucids to govern the eastern territories by granting degrees of power to local dynasts of Iranian origin in exchange for formal allegiance and economic and military cooperation. However, during periods of significant weakness for the Seleucid dynasty, especially with the progressive advance of the Arsakid Empire towards the west, these territories asserted their independence. As shown on the map, the Iranian regions that broke away from Seleucid control were Parthia and Bactria in Central Asia, as well as Karacene, Elymais, and Persis in southwestern Iran. The satrapy of Bactria seceded from the Seleucid Empire sometime around the mid-3rd century BCE. The sources do not allow for a precise chronology, both due to their often imprecise and sometimes contradictory accounts and their tendency to link Bactria's independence with that of Parthia. Nevertheless, classical sources leave no doubt that Diodotus, the Greco-Macedonian satrap, rebelled against Seleucid authority and established an independent rule. This can be corroborated by this passage from Justin, where it is mentioned that Diodotus also revolted and ordered himself to be called king. This is further confirmed by his coinage, which, while maintaining the same iconography, replaced the legend Basileos Antiochou with Basileos Diodotou. The region of Karacene, located at the confluence of the Tigris and the Euphrates, with a predominantly Semitic population, gained independence under the leadership of Hispausines, an Iranian dynasty around 140 BCE. Pliny refers to this dynasty, Spausines, son of Sagdodonacus, as the ruler of the city of Charax. Pliny mentions that Juba claimed he was satrap of Antiochus, while Pliny himself denies this, which seems to be a confusion arising from the recently acquired independent status of Hispausines. He also attests to some instability in the region during the Seleucid rule, recounting that Numenius, an official appointed by King Antiochus to Mesene, that is, Karacene, was victorious in 2 battles against the Persians, likely referring to Iranians in general. However, this passage is somewhat problematic and raises interpretative difficulties. Additionally, Hispausines issued coins bearing the legend Basileos Hispausinou, which suggests that he had acquired the prerogative to mint his own coins, which is generally, though not always, a sign of political independence. And moreover, a cuneiform tablet from the 127 BCE, using the Seleucid era, refers to a king named Aspasine. However, another cuneiform tablet, which we will examine in the next slide, records a conflict between Caracenians and Elymians in 138 BCE, which may indicate that the independence movement had already begun by then. Besides, an inscription found in Tylos, modern Bahrain, dedicated by a certain Kephisodorus in honor of King Hispausines, provide evidence for the extent of the kingdom of Karacini, which may have included some islands in the Persian Gulf. Elymais appears to have achieved independence around 140 BCE, coinciding with the earliest known coinage issued by Camnaschires II. It is uncertain whether his name is Iranian or Elamite, but certainly, although Elymais is not entirely an Iranian region, its central role in the Achaemenid Empire warrants its inclusion in this list. As mentioned before, A cuneiform tablet from 138 BCE documents conflicts between the Elymaians and Coricinians, which may serve as evidence of one or both regions gaining autonomy or independence. The text clearly mentioned that these Aspasine, his Pausines, sent an army against the Elamite enemy. Although the independence of Parthia remains somewhat unclear in the sources, it appears that Andragoras, the region's satrap, rebelled against Seleucid authority around the mid-3rd century BCE. Shortly afterward, his satrapy was invaded by Iranian nomads from the north, the Parni, whose leader, Arsaces, is believed to have founded the Arsacid Parthian Empire. A letter from Arsacid king Artabanus II, addressed to the city of Susa and preserved as an inscription, is dated according to the Seleucid era in the year 333. Considering that the Seleucid era begins in 311 BCE, following Seleucus' re-entry into Babylonia after having been expelled by Antigonus of Talmus, the letter must be dated to 21 CE. However, it is also dated to the year 268 of the Arsacid era. If we calculate the difference between 333 and 268, it shows that the Arsacid era began 65 years after the Seleucid era, that is in 246 BCE, a date close to 250 BCE, as most sources indicate. Persis was ruled by local dynasts from a debated date, somewhere between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. It remains uncertain whether these dynasts act independently or maintain formal subordination to the Seleucids. On occasions, these rulers employed iconographic references to the Achaimenid, such as the enthronement scene of Baidat, which appears to imitate a similar representation of King Darius. A coin attributed to Baghbarth depicts a Persian-clad figure executing a Greco-Macedonian soldier. However, it is significant that the title given to this dynasty, Frataraka, refers to a sub-satrapal administrative position already documented in the Achaemenid period in 4 Aramaic papyri from Elephantine dating to the 5th century BCE. Likewise, the exceptional title Kerni, used by Baghbarth, if identified with the Karanos mentioned by Xenophon in reference to Cyrus the Younger, would indicate a military office with special powers, yet still subordinate to the king's authority. Okay, there is some debate about the influence of Achaemenid imperial ideology on the Seleucids. Until late 20th century, scholars saw the Seleucid Empire as a largely Greco-Macedonian kingdom focused on Syria and reliant on its Greco-Macedonian settlers. At the end of the 20th century, scholars started to emphasize the role of indigenous populations and Eastern traditions. Nevertheless, at times, this trend has led to an exaggeration that resulted in an overestimation of this role to the point of portraying the Seleucid Empire as predominantly Eastern. In this regard, scholarly perspective on Achaemenid influence have fluctuated between underestimation and overstatement. Firstly, regarding royal titulature, Achaemenid rulers predominantly employed titles related to the empire itself, emphasizing the king's royal status or the territories under his rule, such as Ksheyathia Wazarka, great king or powerful king, Ksheyathia Dahyunam, king of the lands, and Ksheyathia Bumiya, king of the country, along with their multiple variants. Several references also emphasize the king's lineage, indicating whether he was the son, Pusa, or grandson, Napa, of a specific monarch. Finally, a few but significant ethnic references assert the monarch's identity as an Achaemenid, a Persian, and an Aryan. that is an Iranian. If we take a look at the titulature used by the Seleucids, its distinctly different nature can be observed. Seleucid royal titles mainly refer to the ruler's achievement, divine associations, metaphorical or physical traits, praise of lineage and family, and lastly, references to his origins, usually his birthplace or place of upbringing. Thus, the only clear similarities between Achaemenid and Seleucid titulature are the literal use of the title king and references to the ruler's lineage, since the name of the Seleucid kings are often accompanied by their father's name. Additionally, scholars frequently point to possible Achaemenid influence in Antiochus III title Megas Basileus, which may reflect the Old Persian Xeyathia Wazarka. While this influence, potentially transmitted by Mesopotamian scribes, is plausible, it must be understood within a very specific historical context. Antiochus' eastern Anabasis had resulted in the formal return to obedience of several regions that had previously gained independence. And many of these retained or obtained royal titles, so Antiochus' assumption of the title Great King, Megas Basileus, may have been a strategy to acknowledge the demands of his reconciled subjects while simultaneously asserting a superior hierarchical position. Moreover, the Seleucid adoption of local titles is well documented, particularly in the famous Antiochus Cylinder, where Antiochus I assumes several traditional Mesopotamian titles. In fact, the titulature used is not casual, rather it reflects and reproduces a well-documented tradition previously established by Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Achaemenid dynasties. This suggests that the Seleucids were more interested in addressing their Mesopotamian subjects, over whose territory they exercised much firmer and more direct control than their Iranian subjects. Another frequently discussed aspect is the significance of dynastic marriages between the Seleucid and Iranian dynasties of Asia Minor, which supposedly maintain an Iranian element within the Seleucid family. However, a quick overview of Seleucid marriage alliances shows that the dynasty was much more inclined to marry off its princesses to Iranian rulers than to accept Iranian princesses into the royal Seleucid family. Thus, despite those who emphasize the Iranian element in Antiochus I, son of Apama, herself the daughter of the Sogdian ruler Spitamenes, it can generally be said that the Iranian influence on the Seleucid dynasty through dynastic marriages was by no means widespread or significant. Additionally, other minor and circumstantial elements suggest some level of interactions between the Seleucid and Achaemenid traditions. For example, Polybius recounts 3 instances of punishments and tortures, including impalement or crucifixion, a practice uncommon in Greek tradition, with a clear precedent in Achaemenid executions. First, it is mentioned how Antiochus III ordered Molon's body to be crucified, and eventually he was crucified on the slopes of Mount Zagros. Next, the cruelties committed by the courtier Hermias are recounted as he mutilated, killed, and tortured the inhabitants of the city of Seleucia. And finally, it refers to the mutilation of a prisoner who was decapitated and his head sewn onto the rear end of a donkey. The descriptions of the punishments inflicted on rebels by the Achaemenids are similar, as can be seen in these 2 passages from Darius' monumental inscriptions at Beishtun. Speaking in the first person, he first says, I had his nose, ears, and tongue cut off, and had one of his eyes gouged out. He was kept bound at my gate, and all the people could look at him. Then I had him impaled in Ecbatana, and the men who were his chief followers, I had them hanged in Ecbatana within the fortress. And then, in another passage, he goes on to say something similar. I gave the order that Araja and the men who were his foremost followers were impaled at Babylon. Also, with regard to the Rios Beistun inscription, there is a statue of Heracles accompanied by an inscription, both dating to the Seleucid period. The inscription is little more than a dedication in honor of a certain Cleomenes, who is referred to as Hoepitonanos Satrapeion, meaning governor of the upper satrapies. However, what makes this inscription, this monument, particularly significant is the decision to place the dedication alongside King Darius' monumental inscription in a location the Achaimenid regarded as sacred, Bagastana, Bishtun, it's Bagastana, and Bagastana means the place of the gods. This suggests that the Graeco-Macedonians were fully aware of the site's special significance. Regarding the concept of universal empire, although it is largely a subjective definition dependent on conditions that are difficult to verify, it can be argued that there were in general significant differences between the Achemenids and the Seleucids. The Achaemenid Empire can be defined as universal insofar as it never exhibited any ethnic or territorial limitations in its expansionist ambitions. The king took pride in being the conqueror of many and diverse peoples and lands, a notion reflected in his titulature. By contrast, Alexander the Great did not adopt a similar stance during his lifetime. Instead, he framed the propaganda surrounding his conquest around the logic of revenge against the Persians, thereby establishing the Achaemenid Empire as the geographical boundary of his expansion. Although he initiated plans for further conquest, these were ultimately never fulfilled. The Seleucids, as heirs to Alexander's empire, limited themselves to preserve it. Their limited success in this regard may explain why they did not pursue new conquests. Nevertheless, it seems evident that the Seleucid Empire, rather than aspiring to unite all peoples under its rule, merely sought to prevent Alexander's project from collapsing entirely. Consequently, the multi-ethnic character of their empire, as well as its vast territorial extent, appears to have been more circumstantial than deliberate. Regarding royal titulature, it is evident that the Achaemenid employed various titles that were explicitly related to the empire they ruled, emphasizing its cultural and territorial diversity. Inscriptions, such as that of Darius at Naxxerostam, illustrate the pride of the Achaemenids, the pride the Achaemenids took in ruling over such a vast array of people, providing a list of all the territories and nations under their power. In fact, the title later adopted by the Sasanians, Shahanshah Iran ud Iran, King of Kings, King of Iran and non-Iran, which necessarily implied a self-perception as rulers of the entirety, may have been inspired by the Achaemenid drive for unlimited conquest and supranational domination. By contrast, as we have seen earlier, the titulature of the Seleucid monarchs was predominantly personal in nature. It emphasized the metaphorical or physical attributes of the king rather than making explicit references to the territory or the people under his rule. In fact, the notion of a personal empire is a fundamental characteristic of the Seleucid Empire, distinguishing it significantly from Achaemenid model. In various respects, the Seleucid Empire was conceived both ideologically and even legally, not as state in the modern sense, but rather as the private domain of the king. The land was essentially divided between that which belonged to the king, Hora Basilike, and the rest, which could be part of autonomous cities or temple property. A considerable number of settlements, however, was established on royal lands, where their inhabitants enjoyed usufruct rights granted by the king. A clear example is these legal inscriptions, where very clarifying terminology is used when referring to the Hora Basilike, the crown land, and the Basilikoi Laoi, crown peasants. Furthermore, a key element of Seleucid kingship was its military dimension. Seleucus I did not ascend to the throne by right, as he had no legitimate claim to Alexander's empire, but rather through his military prowess and the charisma that enabled him to maintain the support of an army. In this sense, the following passage from Polybius should be understood, where referring to King Antiochus III, he says, because through his campaign he appeared worthy of the kingdom not only to those in Asia, but also to those in Europe. Moreover, the concept of the empire as the king's personal possession is reinforced by expressions such as patron archen, ancestral rule, which Memnon uses in reference to the empire inherited by Antiochus I. On the other hand, Pierre Briand describes the Achaemenid Empire as an ethno-empire, arguing that although a multitude of peoples inhabited its territory, power was exercised almost exclusively by one of them, the Persians. On the other hand, it's clear that the Graeco-Macedonian constituted the core around which the Seleucid monarch administered the kingdom, managed his power, and upheld his position. It is true, however, that the Seleucids showed no hesitation in incorporating indigenous populations into the imperial administration, as they did with the Mesopotamians. Nevertheless, the Macedonian character of the empire is frequently emphasized in the sources, and while this perspective may be somewhat exaggerated, it is difficult to deny that the Greco-Macedonians constitute a privileged class within the empire based on their ethnic and cultural background. This also this should also be understood in light of Justin's references to the Macedonian Empire and the Macedonian king in this text. Similarly, the story narrated by Memnon, in which Seleucus returned to Macedonia after defeating Lysimachus due to nostalgia from his homeland, clearly highlights the ethnic origin of the newly founded empire. In the same way, Antiochus Cylinder refers to Seleucus as the king of the Macedonians, further reinforcing this idea. Finally, this Mesopotamian chronicle, which we have seen before, is significant for its mention of the Politano, that's the Politai, the Greek Macedonian inhabitants, specifically those who oil themselves, who anoint themselves with oil, just like the Politai. A reference, I believe, to the locals who had adopted a Greek way of life and had undergone a process of Hellenization. This points to the Macedonian nature of the empire, which, while respecting local traditions to some extent, remained fundamentally Greek Macedonian and as such promoted and defended its culture. However, it can be argued also that this characteristic applies to a greater or lesser extent to almost any empire and can hardly be regarded as an Achaemenid legacy. Okay, regarding the Seleucid legacy, their most significant contribution, in my opinion, was the process of Hellenization, understood as the dissemination of Greek culture throughout the ancient Near East. This process has often been either downplayed or exaggerated, making a careful and rigorous approach necessarily. Undoubtedly, Greek culture played a significant role in the territories ruled by the Seleucids, as it becomes manifest in various domains such as political organization and territorial organization and urban planning, culture, language, as well as power and politics. Both Alexander and the Seleucids established numerous colonies across their empire, many of which endured into the Arsakid and Sasanian periods. These settlements often exhibit a fusion of urban traditions, resulting in cities and buildings that are recognizably Greco-Macedonian, yet display distinct local characteristics. Besides, the Seleucids had a certain presence in the Persian Gulf, as can be deduced from archaeological remains on the islands of Tilos, Bahrain, and Icaros, Failaka. Moreover, Hellenistic Mesopotamia serves as a clear example of this cultural hybridization, One such instance is a house in Nippur dated to the mid-3rd century BCE, which follows the typical architectural patterns of Greek dwellings. Likewise, the theatres of Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris illustrate the adoption of the Greek way of life. Regarding material culture, the archaeological record is neither extensive nor particularly fruitful. In most cases, artifacts from Hellenistic sites in Iran display irid characteristics that complicate their precise dating, forcing archaeologists to place them in a vague period labeled as Hellenistic, which encompasses both Seleucid and Arsakid dominations. For example, these Parthian figurines from Babylon and Borsippa serve as another clear example of Greek influence in the region. Statuettes of Greek divinities have also been preserved, such as these of Heracles from Seleucia on the Tigris, as well as other examples from Seleucia on the Tigris and Babylon, depicting a Tichet, two soldiers armed in the Graeco-Macedonian style, and a male figure. On the other hand, some artifacts dating to the Arsacid period, such as these from Seleucia of the Tigris and Nisa, show the Greek influence in a stylistic field. In territories that were properly Iranian, Ai-Hanum is a striking example frequently cited in relation to the spread of Greek culture in the East. The city, with its orthogonal urban layout and filled with typically Greek buildings such as temples, a palace, a gymnasium, and a theater, serve as a perfect example of a Greek city located in present-day Afghanistan. However, a closer look reveals a mixture of customs and traditions. For example, the Temple of Zeus has a rather unusual internal structure, like the Temple of the Dioscuri located in Dilbergin. As an example, these two domestic units of Ai-Hanum and Ekatompilos are very similar, although they have their own characteristics that differentiate them. This temple, located in Taxila in present-day Pakistan, in a typically Greek style, is nevertheless dated to the Indo-Scythian period. A similar case is found with another temple from Chalchayan, which is somewhat less Greek in its design. In contrast, another building located in Hellenistic Chorasmia perhaps show some Greek influence in its internal structure. On the other hand, the Greek language played a rather secondary role in Seleucid Iran. However, its presence in inscriptions bearing the names of various deities found in Persepolis is not noteworthy. Notwithstanding this, the document known as the Stela of Sophitos represents an exceptional use of Greek in a region such as Aragosia, and also reflects a claim to an acquired ethnocultural identity by an individual of Iranian, Indo-Iranian origin. Furthermore, during the Arsacid rule, Greek became a prestigious language frequently employed by rulers in both official and private inscriptions. The use of Seleucid era as a dating system, although not the only method available, persisted over time. A famous example is the statue of Heracles or Werethragna, bearing a bilingual inscription in Greek and Parthian on its sides, recounting a military campaign led by Arsaces Vologases in the region of Karasene. This Mesopotamian chronicle recounts the moment when Seleucus ordered documents to be dated from the time of his entry into Babylon. The designation of his son as Bisra during his lifetime led to the situation where, upon Seleucus' death, Antiochus did not consider his reign to have started then, and therefore he continued dating from the year of his father's entry into Babylon. This method was maintained through the successive Seleucid kings and also during the Arsacid Empire. In addition, there are several testimonies that demonstrate that the use of Greek remained common during the Arsacid period, both in public and official spheres as well as in private ones. Evidence of this is this famous inscription found in a cave that likely served as a dwelling located in Carafto in Media. Furthermore, as we have seen before, a letter from the Arsakid king Artabanus II, addressed to the city of Susa, written in Greek, has also been preserved. Similarly, some of the famous Avroman parchment, mainly contracts and legal documents dating to the Arsakid period, are written in Greek, such as this one documenting a land purchase. Additionally, the cuneiform tablets of the series known as Greco-Babylonica, written in Akkadian and transliterated into Greek, demonstrate the local population interest in learning Greek during both the Seleucid and Arsakid periods. Similarly, in Seleucid and Persian Mesopotamia, the phenomenon of using dual names is well documented, whereby some individuals would have used a Greek name in their dealings with the administration. Evidence for this can be found in the following documents. A cuneiform tablet records the use of the Greek name Kephalon by an individual from Uruk named Anubalid. This is also tested in another text written in Aramaic. In fact, several members of his family are known to have adopted Greek names as well. This phenomenon is also tested in a Greek inscriptions dated to the Seleucid or Arsakid period, in which a certain Ardibeltius also adopts the name Aristeas. In a more official context, a cuneiform tablet records that King Antiochus himself granted the Greek name Nicarchus to Anubalid, a different individual from the one mentioned above. However, it is important to note that this phenomenon has been exclusively documented among the Semitic population of Mesopotamia, both during the Seleucid and Arsakid periods, but not among Iranians. Under the Sasanians, Greek retained its status as a prestige language, with monarchs employing it in their royal inscriptions alongside Middle Persian and Parthian. An example is the famous inscriptions of Shebur I at the Kabaye Sartosht in Naxerostam. Also, this is the famous inscription of the coronation of Ardashir, located at Naxerostam. Its composition in Greek also implies that the monarch was aware that some of his subjects could understand the language and perceive it as their own. It is also possible that Greek was seen as a prestige language. Furthermore, the text notably identifies Ahura Mazda, or must by, with Zeus, Dios Theou. Moreover, the inscription of Shabur I, located at Naxerrajab, also has a version in Greek. On the other hand, these kings and dynasts commonly use a titulature that, unlike the epithets typically employed by the Achaemenid monarchs, as we saw earlier, closely resembles that of the Seleucids. Furthermore, these kingdoms again use Greek for political propaganda, which is highly significant. Similarly, Greek influence can be observed in the coinage of various Iranian kingdoms during the Hellenistic period. Iranian rulers from regions as diverse and distant as Bithynia and Cappadocia, whose population was largely Anatolian with significant Greek influence, Karsene with a predominantly Semitic population, and Elamites, inhabited possibly by Elamites and Iranians, all imitate the iconography of Seleucid coins. It is likely that there was a connection between Seleucid coinage and the representation of power during the Hellenistic period, so that the smaller kingdoms limited themselves to imitating the iconography of the dominant hegemonic powers of their time. Well, it seems clear that the Seleucids were forced to govern the eastern territories of their empire indirectly, granting significant degrees of autonomy to certain dynasts while limiting their role to demanding formal obedience. When the Seleucid Empire was replaced as the hegemonic power of the Near East by the Arsacids, the latter adopted several practices implemented by their predecessors. Among these was the indirect governance of the regions which lay farther from the empire's core, in this case, the West. This text by Strabo, which recounts the history of Media Tropatene, perfectly reflects the kingdom's relationship with the regional empires. The territory is governed autonomously, while marriages are established with the hegemonic empire, and in practice, it acts as a vassal. The autonomy of these vassal states is demonstrated, among other things, by the fact that their Sassid granted them the power to mint coins. Through these coin issues, we know the majority of the monarchs of these vassal states, such as Elymas, Persis, Caracene, or Armenia. And lastly, in Iranian sources, the Seleucids play an invisible role. In the preserved corpus of Pahlavi literature, there does not seem to be a single mention of them, and it will not be until the historical and geographical works of Persian historians from the Islamic period that vague and often incorrect references to a few renowned monarchs such as Seleucus I, Antiochus I, or Antiochus III appear. It seems that Pahlavi sources tend to concentrate the entire Greco-Macedonian domination into a single representative figure of the entire period, Alexander. His memory likely represented the Iranian Sasanian view of Greek presence in Iran, and it was certainly not a positive one. There exists a dual tradition in Persian culture regarding the figure of Alexander. The epic tradition, stemming from the Syriac version of the Romance of Alexander, which culminates in Ferdowsi Shahnameh in the 10th century, depicts Alexander as actually the son of the Gayanian king Darab and the rightful heir to the throne, ahead of his half-brother Dara, both forms going back to the name of Darius. This justifies his conquest of the Achaemenid Empire, and in fact he is portrayed as an Iranian hero. On the other hand, the religious literature, which represents most of the preserved Pahlavi literature, offers a much more negative view of Alexander. He is characterized as a foreign conqueror and vilified as the destroyer of the Vesta, the sacred book of Zoroastrianism. As already noted, historical accounts, often distorted by religious or even propagandistic content, skip directly from Alexander to the Sassids, completely ignoring the Seleucids. This text by Tacitus refers to the Sasanian monarch and his statement that he will recover the ancient borders of the Persian and Macedonians, clearly marking which heritage he wants to claim, the one from the Achaemenid Empire and from Alexander's empire, or even the Seleucids. In similar terms, Ammianus Marcellinus attributes to Shabur a speech in which the Sasanian monarch claims the Macedonian frontiers as his own. By contrast, Cassius Dio refers to Ardashir the first claiming the former Persian Achaemenid borders. Turning now to Iranian sources, the Arda Wiraz Namak refers to Alexander in the typical terms of Iranian tradition. In a few words, he is portrayed as a cursed figure due to his role as the destroyer of the Avesta. However, he is also referred to as Roman, Chromagic, um, and in the historical context of the work, the Sasanian Empire was in opposition to the Roman Empire and later the Eastern Roman Empire. Just as classical authors sometimes simplify and refer to various Eastern Iranian empires as Persians, it is plausible to think that Persian authors refer to the Westerners with a generic and simplifying term like Roman. This broad and generalized treatment of history, as well as the complete absence of the Seleucids in Middle Iranian sources, leads one to believe that these authors merged the figure of Alexander and the negative aspects of his reign into the entire period of the Greco-Macedonian domination, which encompasses the kingdom of Alexander and Seleucid Empire. According to the words of the text, Alexander burned the Vesta and the Zand, the commentary of the Vesta, murdered several Dashturs, judges, Herbats, and Mobads, and finally fled to the hell. Equally significant is the descriptions the text provides of the period following Alexander's death, stating that there were confusion and contention among the people of the country of Iran. They had no lord, nor ruler, nor chieftain, nor destur who was acquainted with the religion. The traditional view reflected in Iranian literature is that after Alexander's death, Iran was divided into multiple kingdoms, usually identified with their Sassids and their numerous vassal states, until it was reunited under the Sasanians. In these passages from the Shahrestaniha Iranshar, a work of geographical content, we again find references to Alexander as a cursed ruler. In this passage from the San Ibahman Yazn, the Arsakid rulers are referred to as those who freed the world from the wicked Alexander. The mission of the Seleucids once again suggests that the Persian authors included them within Alexander's reign. In this passage from the Bundachischen, we once again find the same themes regarding the figure of Alexander, his designation as Roman, and his negative characterization due to his treatment of the Vesta and Zoroastrian religion. In later sources, the perspective is completely different. Alongside the religious tradition, which viewed Alexander negatively for his actions against the Vesta and Zoroastrianism, there existed an epic tradition that likely originated with the Romance of Alexander, which reached the Sasanians through its Syriac version brought by exiled Nestorians. In this tradition, reflected here in the Shahnameh, the great work of Persian literature, Alexander is actually um, the legitimate heir to the Persian throne and the brother of Darius III. His conquest is justified on the pretext of exercising his legitimate succession rights, being the firstborn. This is understood in the following passage, where Alexander himself sends a letter to various local leaders addressing himself as the king of the Kayanian dynasty. The Kayanians were a legendary dynasty of Iranian kings mentioned in the Vesta and other Persian traditions. The reinterpretation of Alexander's figure is clear. However, this is done by turning him Iranian, which implies that the Iranian view of Greco-Macedonian domination has not necessarily improved. On the other hand, an example of the enduring figure of Alexander is this poem written by the Safavid Shah Ismail in Ottoman Turkish. In it, he refers to himself as the Alexander of his contemporaries, demonstrating the positive role that Alexander had eventually acquired in Iranian tradition. In contrast, and finally, in this other text by Al-Tabari, translated by Pellman, we can see the actual knowledge the Persians had of their own past and ultimately of Greco-Macedonian rule. First of all, the author highlights his reference to the period of regional princes. In the Arab-Persian historiographical tradition, after Alexander's death, Iranian was ruled by multiple feudal lords, an image that most likely reflects the political fragmentation of the Sassanid Empire and its tendency towards indirect rule, which we have previously discussed. Next, Al-Tabari quotes the opinion of Hisham ben Muhammad, stating that the Seleucids ruled the empire after Alexander's death. He also recounts that the rebellion of the Sassids. He also recounts the rebellion of the Sassids and the confrontation between Arsaces, the Persian king, and a king Antiochus, not specifying which one. He does not go into much detail on any aspect, showing that knowledge about the Seleucid was limited, but by no means disappeared, as it had persisted until that period. As we have seen, the Seleucid presence in Iran was both geographically and temporally limited. Imperial control was primarily exerted through the administration of cities and the allegiance of regional dynasts. However, most Seleucid settlements were concentrated along the border with Mesopotamia, while much of Iran saw few foundations, many of which quickly gained independence, particularly under the leadership of Parthia and Bactria. Their Sassanid advance culminated in the mid-2nd century BCE with the loss of the empire's last Iranian territories. Regarding academic Achaimenid influence, we have identified its limitations. The Seleucids adapted the newly conquered empire to their needs and capabilities, relying primarily on the Greco-Macedonian population, but also collaborating with local groups when necessary. In this regard, they demonstrated flexibility in addressing the various challenges inherent to their rule. Within this context, they encountered some of the same conflicts and administrative issues that the Achaemenids had previously faced. This explains why certain similarities can be observed between the two empires. However, a detailed analysis of the Babel evidence does not support the notion of a deliberate continuity in imperial or royal ideology. Nevertheless, the Seleucids exerted a degree of influence on those who succeeded them as the dominant power in Near East, the Arsacids. Like the Seleucids, the Arsacids faced challenges arising the vast territorial expanse and diverse composition of their empire. As a result, they adopted similar measures to those of their predecessors. Moreover, the enduring presence of Greek culture in the region ensured its influence within the Arsacid Empire, with the Greek language and way of life playing a significant role in shaping Arsacid rule. The rise of the Sasanian Empire, however, marked a fundamental shift in approach. Unlike their predecessors, the Sasanian grounded their imperial ideology in Achaemenid traditions, rejecting the influence of Greek culture and constructing a strong Iranian identity. In line with this, the historical memory of the Greco-Macedonian presence in Iran, reduced almost exclusively to the figure of Alexander, was distinctly hostile, an attitude that has persisted to present-day Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Raúl. That was an outstanding presentation, an excellent synthesis of a very large field, so very impressive. But I am not the one who is going to give you an appraisal. I am very pleased that Dr. David Engels has accepted my invitation, and I could not think of anyone better suited to do this. Not just because he is with the Seleukid study group from its very beginning in 2008 or so, but rather his concentration has for most been on the Iranian traditions within the Seleukid kingdom. So he has authored this important book, Benefactors, Kings, Rulers, Studies on the Seleukid Empire between East and West, published in the Studia Hellenistica, volume 57 in 2017. David Engels studied history with a focus on Greek and Roman history, but also many other disciplines, including Arabistic and music, at the Rheinisch-Westfälische Technische Hochschule Aachen. I can give that title by heart because it happens to be my hometown. We have quite a bit in common, although we are not citizens of the same state. David is from the German-speaking Belgian community, so just from the other side. But there is a lot that unites us in friendship for some decades now. David, after gaining all his academic degrees to the PhD from the University of Aachen, now in the simplified version, was appointed chair of Roman history at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, where he also directed the Société and the journal L'Atomus for several years before he took up an appointment as a senior analyst in the Institute for European Studies in Poznan. And right now, as we chatted initially, he is instructor at the Institut Catholique de Vendée, if I have this correct. And this is located a little bit south of Nantes in western France. And David, we are now very pleased to have your feedback to Raúl's paper.
Yeah, well, thank you very much also, dear Alta, for this presentation. I feel really humbled of having been invited also to participate or to give some feedback. As you may have heard, my 2017 book on exactly this subject is already some years old, and I admit that in the meantime, much of my research has been addressed to a lot of other issues also, especially comparative history of great civilizations, which is also one of the or some of the lectures I'm giving over here. So I may perhaps not be entirely up to date when it concerns this the Seleukid studies, but I will try to do my best. So first, a lot of congratulations, of course, on this brilliant lecture. So I already wondered how you would be able to fit the content of several hundred pages into 60 minutes, and this was really a remarkable feat. So congratulations already on that, and also on your magnificent PowerPoint presentation. So this is really the kind of compilation of sources that makes everything extremely clear. So I'm really impressed by that. And also you managed to present that without the risk that is always present, of course, of oversimplification, even though these subjects are extremely complex. So I'm really looking forward to see also the book that I'm sure will emerge out of that, and would be really happy to be able to study that in detail, even more so as basically the book Altair alluded to, Benefactors, Kings and Rulers, it treated essentially the same subject as yours. One could say that probably 95% of the source material you presented and analyzed is also the basis of what I then tried to do 10 years ago. So perhaps some then constructive critical remarks, which is, I suppose, the job I'm supposed to do. They would go into two directions, as usually. One that is, let's say, a bit more when it comes to the general definition of the project. The other when it comes rather to some separate issues, even though they certain way join together. Perhaps to start with the more general question, and I'm sure this is probably also due to the fact that usually in that kind of presentation you skip usually all the methodological stuff and remarks in order to make things. Is it just me, or can you also hear some form of interferences, or no? You can all hear me somehow still.
Yes, we hear you great.
Okay, super. It was just to be sure that I didn't speak into the void. So the more general remarks. If I understood your first slides well, and also the text, then the object is to study forms of continuity or influence, and of course discontinuity. And so I think this would need, of course, for the printed version, a good definition of what that means, basically, influence. Because you initially you said there is some slight influence of on the Achaimenids on the Seleukids, and then significant influence of the Seleukids on the Arsakids and the Sasanians. And of course that raises the question, what does that mean, basically, influence, and when is it slight, when is it significant? And for example, my own take on that would be that from my point of view, I would see a lot more significant influence of the Achaimenid on the Seleukids than, for example, of the Seleukids on the Sasanians. So I mean, I'm really happy to see that you seem to indicate there are some phenomena of continuity to the Sasanians, but I don't really see them a lot. And also from your presentation, I rather gathered the other way around, basically, that there is as good as no significant influence of the Seleukids on the Sasanians at all. So I think we would need that definition, and perhaps in order you would perhaps need to build up a framework of analysis in order to measure somehow, at least to define whatever you mean by significant or slight or whatever form of significance. And I think to do that, you would need to somehow enlarge a little bit your methodology on the entire Middle East, not in order to include all the other examples, but without only taking the Achaimenids, the Seleukids, and the Arsakids, we should perhaps also say, okay, well, but what about then the influence, for example, of the Assyrians on the Neo-Babylonians, of the Neo-Babylonians on the Achaemenids? Is this the same? I mean, what are the criteria for us to define what kind of influence we would expect, and to define what would be, so to say, the normalcy of influence, in comparison of which we can measure if this is significant or only slides. And I think this kind of words, so when we have these long-term continuity from one dynasty or ruling ethnoclass to the other, it would be good to place this into a more general context so that we can confidently say, okay, the influence of the Achaemenids on the Seleukids is lesser than, for example, of X on Y, or of Y on Z, so that we have something a bit more absolute. If not, this remains very subjective and a bit floating, what slight or significant or so means. But probably you do that already in the introduction of your written book. I'm quite sure about that. So this is the more general remark. Now, perhaps for some chosen elements, and I'm sure that there are two probably in the written version of your work. You are absolutely, I guess, conscious about that, and that it's just for reasons out of time that you couldn't really dwell on that here. But still, I put them forth. So I think one of the terms, and probably if you read my book, this is no wonder to you. One of the elements that is, of course, an interesting continuity relies with the term of feudalism, which not only myself but also Rolf Strothmann and others have introduced into the study of the Seleucid Empire, in order to show that indeed there is some form of continuity, not only from the Seleucids on the Arsacids, but also already from the Achaemenids on the Seleucids, because already the late Achaemenid Empire is, of course, already feudalizing with these semi-independent satrapal dynasties being settled here and there, breaking away, going over to Alexander, and basically explaining why this nascent Seleucid Empire had to confirm a series of the settlements also already made by Alexander, in order to confirm its grasp on the empire. So I think that this idea of feudalism is also interesting in order to better understand what these forms of independences and breaking away means, because you very often use this word of, okay, the Bactrians break away, or the Parthians break away, or they take the title of king, and so they become independent. And I'm not really sure if these are terms like independency and breaking away that we could use with a lot of confidence within a more feudal context, with a bit more floating criteria of autonomy. I feel that it's something that is important in order to see how this concept of feudalism, that is quite strange and foreign to a Greco-Macedonian mindset, is present in Iran and in the Near East already before Alexander and the Seleucids come in, and that is taken over also as a concept of rule, and then of course passed over on the Arsacids. So I think that might be an important place. Another one is, of course, your analysis of the titulature about King of Kings and Great Kings. And so, of course, you contrast the titulature of the Achaemenids with the titles and the epithets of the Seleucid kings, in order to conclude that, well, we have some significant differences. But I mean, it's not up to me to bring that up. You are, I think, better conscious about that than myself, that we have extremely different supports. I mean, on the one hand, you have as a support the royal inscriptions of the Achaemenids on some chosen places, essentially on the Iranian plateau, addressing themselves, let's say, to a very specific audience. And on the other hand, we have some literary sources, coins or whatever, that are essentially addressed to a Greek audience that transport this royal titulature. So would we even expect titles like Great King or King of Kings appear in that kind of sources? Because the support and the literary genre is extremely different. So it's a bit like comparing, as the Germans would say, apples and pears, because basically it's the support is different, the context is different, the genre is different. So it's not so surprising that the result would be also different. Another remark is when you compared in one of these slides how did you formulate the Achaimenid with their demonstration of conquered peoples and the Seleukids with their alleged focus on the Graeco-Macedonians, not the conquered people. Well, that is, of course, also something that could be open to debate if you look at another point that passed over perhaps a bit quickly, and that is, of course, the quite syncretistic, quite multicultural foundation of the Seleucid colonies in the East, with the present, which you alluded to, of Iranian or Eastern style palaces, of Iranian and Babylonian style temples, and so forth. So from a certain point of view, these very syncretistic city foundations in the East are also a presentation of conquered peoples, and that also mirrors, of course, the very multicultural meaning of that empire. So I think there could be a certain case made also for deploying multiculturality. Also, well, I thought, perhaps it's my Seleucid patriotism, but when you spoke about the limited extent or the limited control over Alexander, or that the Seleucids limited themselves to Alexander's empire in terms of control. I mean, they tried to go beyond that, of course. I mean, I don't see really in the sources any wise self-limitations of the Seleucids. To the contrary, I mean, from Seleucus I until at least Antiochus VII, we have this wish of gaining more power, of going over, spilling over even to Europe, of conquering Egypt time and again, of getting back the Eastern satrapies. So I mean, yes, their empire is not as big as the Achaemenid one, as we have the other Hellenistic monarchies, but they tried. I think they really tried to put that on to gain this back, and I think that even within their limits, the case that was made by Cosmin on how they saw their own power and how they tried to present and understand their own empire as already being a universal global empire, at least over the entirety of Asia, is a good case that I think could be made also here. This already says also what I saw about your remarks on the Greek way of life. And yeah, obviously, I mean, I would never negate the fact that indeed there were a lot of Greeks and Macedonians in the East, and temples and language and artwork and so on. All that is okay, but also, I mean, something like Ai-Khanum is only in a very limited way a typical Greek foundation, and has these multicultural imperial language that is much more than just transferring a model from Greece somewhere into the East, but that is from the moment of the foundation on something that tries to include local populations, not only from the place itself, but also from the entirety of the empire. Then perhaps another point also about the continuity or not of the Greek language. So you showed, of course, which obviously this continuity of Greek from the period of the Seleucids to the Arsakids, and then certain point of view even to to the Sasanians. That is of course true, but we shouldn't forget that also before, of course, we have this continuity, for example, of imperial Aramean that is still used here and there in official texts, also from the Seleucid Empire, so that you could make a case also for other forms of continuity from before until the Seleucids. And also, if you look at the inscriptions, of course, of Ashoka in India, you also see the presence of Aramean well into the Hellenistic times. So this is, of course, continued to be used and makes a strong case, not just for the import of a foreign language that is Greek onto the Iran, but also the continuity of the import of an equally foreign language, which is Aramean or imperial Aramean, right into the Hellenistic period. So I would see rather an overlapping form of continuity. Then two last points, and then I will leave it there. Perhaps one point on and I'm sure you treat that in your book, of continuity that is highly interesting, that is religious continuity. And so there is, of course, this highly interesting story about the Persian feast organized by the Seleucids at the siege of Damascus, which is one of the proofs that there is a certain presence of Persian soldiers, and obviously also a certain interest by the Seleucid king of Mazdean, probably, forms of religiosity. And also let us not forget the foundation stories of most of the cities of the Tetrapolis, notably in that is conserved also in the fragments of the Greek historians. I just edited, by the way, the last large volume of the Fragmente der griechischen Historiker, where we present a lot of these foundational stories, and they make it very clear that in these stories we have strong Iranian components that are there in the description of the foundation, the importance of fire altars already for Seleucus and Antiochus. So that is, of course, also an interesting case to be made, the influence of Perseus and the myth of Perseus for the early Seleucids, that also suggests conscious forms of continuity, at least at the beginning. And the last point now, as I said, is the interesting point you made, which is also obvious, which has always also amazed me, that is the total absence of knowledge about the Seleucids in Sasanian historiography, as it has gone down to At-Tabari, and who has quite good sources in Sasanian history, and who shows that basically whatever is before, apart from Alexander and some vague reminiscence about the Arsakids, is more or less nil. So this tends, of course, at first view to suggest some form of, I wouldn't say damnatio memoria, but of absence of continuity, which would be, from a certain point of view, the contrary of what you said, because you spoke about significant influences. Thou rather, from that point of view, there would be an absence of influence in terms also of historical knowledge and of shared form of identity. But of course, what we should not forget is that the Sasanians also had no idea at all about Achaemenid history, which is, after all, an important part of their own. And so if you know what the Sasanians knew about the high point of Iranian civilization, that is the Achaimenid, there is basically nothing. Even in the Shahmaneh, there is not much left. And which is even more curious, as the Sasanians would just have to grab a copy of Herodotus from somewhere in their library, there must be some around, in order to know what their own predecessors were up to and whatever they did, but apparently they were not interested in that. And so I think this is something we need to bring forth also, because if we analyze the absence of knowledge about the Seleucids in terms of historical continuity, and thus also of impact, we could make pretty much the same case for the Achaimenid, which sounds, of course, a bit absurd, but which is there, and which explains why for example, our late Arab sources, for them, the entirety of Achaemenid history is also totally absent. So these were my different points. I just wanted to share with you in order to give some feedback. But once again, I'm sure that all of that is addressed anyway in your written work. But for whatever it's worth, I just wanted to bring some remarks onto the fore. But of course, congratulations for this magnificent compilation, and for all the enormous mass of information you are mastering, and you are playing and juggling with. This is really highly impressive, and I'm looking forward very much to reading your book once it's finished.
Thank you very much, David. That was very generous, constructive feedback and a good base for our discussion. And of course, Raúl, you will be the first asked to respond and to engage.
Thank you very much for your feedback. I think it's very helpful in order to improve my dissertation, my ongoing dissertation. I wanted to say a few things about what you said that I think that is quite interesting. For example, I like so much the comment you said about the concept of feudalism and its relationship with the territorial organization of Hellenistic Near East under the Arsakids. And for example, in my case, I find quite interesting the fact that the Pahlavi sources or Iranian late sources always speak about the feudal lords who ruled Iran after Alexander. And I think that this connection between the Iranian sources, which most of all are vague and not very precise, and the reality we have under the Arsakids, and including also under the Seleukids, when the territory was organized in this way, I think that this is quite interesting. Also, I would like to say you talk about religious continuity. And I think also that this is like a great, it could be a great research about religious continuity between the Seleucid and other periods before and after. For example, I'm also working on a series of texts about the Seleucid plundering of temples in Elymais. I have been working with texts from the Maccabean books, and also from other Hellenistic historians. And one of the things that I saw that make me think about the possibility of this religious continuity is the mention, I think it was in the first book of the Maccabees, that the king Antiochus had the intention to marry the goddess Nanaya of the Elimean temple. And I remember that when I was studying Akkadian and Mesopotamian civilization, that this was a traditional festival which was held in the Sagil and in the some Mesopotamian temples, where was usual that the king perform this kind of act. And I think that that's also quite interesting. And of course, the text, the Sasanian text, which presents the name of Aura Mazda, and in the Greek version presents the name of Zeus. It's also quite interesting because shows that in a Greek sense, until a late date, there was some kind of syncretism or identification between Greek and Persian divinities. I also remember that there are some authors who defend that the inscriptions bearing Greek god names in Persepolis, these 5 inscriptions, in fact, were referring to Persian gods, identified with its Greek names. For example, Zeus appears with the epithet Megistos, and there are some people who defend that this Zeus Megistos is the Greek version of Ahura Mazda. So I think that the study of religious continuity can also be a good way to make research, because it's quite interesting, and I think that something great could be done in this area. And another thing I wanted to say is about Sasanian historiography, which I think it's quite interesting. I think that Pahlavi literature is quite interesting, not only about Iranian tradition or Iranian history, but also about the, the description they do about their own past. For example, you said that the Sasanians had no clue about Achaemenid history, and this is shocking. This is an amazing thing, because when, for example, when you're reading the Shahnameh or this kind of literature, you can see that it seems like they had no idea about their own past, and it's quite shocking, and it's also, I think that, for example, when we're reading some Persian authors from the Islamic period and what they speak about the Seleucids or the period after Alexander, we can see that the knowledge they had at that moment was problematic. Because I had only presented one text of Al-Tabari, because I am going to talk about this in the Seleukid study days in November. But there are a lot of Persian authors from the Islamic period who talk about the Seleucids or the period after Alexander, and they make a lot of mistakes. Most of them think that the Seleucids didn't exist, and the Ptolemaics were the heirs of Alexander. Most of them think that their Sassids were in fact the heirs of Alexander, and that is related also to what you have you said before
There
about
is a lot of that in Al-Mas'udi, for example. Al-Mas'udi is a specialist on Egyptian history who deals a lot with Ptolemaic history. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Hmm. He's one of the authors I have started to read, and I have to start working. And to be honest, I'm looking forward to the Seleukid study days in November, because I think that this research, which is not quite related to my dissertation, it's a little bit related, but not it's not the same. And I think it's quite interesting, and I'm looking forward to read all the texts I can, and to and to read as much as I can.
Can I just congratulate you on your Tolkien collection, which is right behind? You know, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, so I recognize them even from here. Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. So I think it's the right moment to open the floor to questions or comments from the audience. Anyone is welcome to come forward while you are still thinking about a question or a comment. I was musing when you were presenting the two different ways of perception of Alexander in the Iranian tradition, which I've also just come across in my Alexander lecture this term, but only briefly. I was wondering whether we should assume that the different traditions you have pointed to share the awareness that this is the same historical individual. And in fact, after you and David have pointed out once more how little knowledge of history there was from the Sasanian period onwards, I would even express it as a doubt that they brought anyhow together these different individuals. What's your thought on this?
I think that the 2 points of view about Alexander in Sasanian and Iranian tradition are quite interesting because, as I said, the Alexander depicted by the epic works is like an Iranian hero. He's like they have a new vision of Alexander. They think that Alexander was the son of Achaemenid king called Darius and the brother of another Darius. And for example, in religious tradition, Alexander is only the man who came to Iran and to burn the Vesta and literature and sacred literature. I'm not an expert in the topic, but as much as I know, the Iranian epic tradition comes from the Alexander Romans, the Greek Alexander Romans, who came into Iran through the Syriac version. And of course, at this point, the figure of Alexander is completely different from historical Alexander. There are a lot of magic in this account, and the text, the religious text who had a bad opinion about Alexander, perhaps they're more historical in the sense that they remember negatively the conquest of what in fact was a foreign conqueror. It's curious also that, for example, in medieval period and even in modern Iran, there is also a tradition of Skandarnama and other Alexander works. And there is also a double tradition in which there were some books and poems and this kind of literature created in feudal courts and around the king and by poets who were like defended by their own kings and so on. And the vision that they have about Alexander is most positive. You know, the entourage of the king had a good vision of Alexander, as we have seen, for example, in the text of the Shah Ismail from the Safavid period. But also, there were literature popular among the common people, in which Alexander preserved his bad point of view, in which Alexander was only a foreign conqueror, and this is most of all because the epic tradition was most read by the king and his entourage, while the common people got in touch most of all with religious tradition, and it's curious that this double tradition in Sasanian and medieval Persia has survived into modern Iran.
Thank you very much for this. Now, Marion, you have something.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to thank for these very rich contributions from both sides and follow up on the general remark by David and make an even more general remark. I think that the word influence in any language has, been used like an inflation. And I think very often it is used for conditions that mean the exact opposite. Like when you were speaking about the influence in your presentation, it insinuates that the Achaimenids, after the fall of the empire, had some kind of power just by being there or by having this culture. And then, the same thing happened with the Seleukids. But I would rather suggest to apply the notion of reception, which shifts the perspective to the agent. And so if you look for specific elements of a former reign that has been accepted, adopted, adapted, then this could make it maybe easier to find reasons, explanations, interpretations for this specific act of reception. Because it's not that, there was something that was continued or adapted because it was there, but because it was of a special interest. So I would strongly just advise, by shifting this perspective, one might get maybe a new access. And I do have a question. What really strikes me is that not only with the Achaemenids, but also their predecessors in these central, not central, in these Iranian cultures, there has always been, it seems to me, the habit of having inscriptions in various languages. So this this says something. It's a claim. It also proves, that you have the dominance over a wide area with very many ethnic. Whereas the Seleukids, although they tried, of course, to cater to locals, and of course they performed like the local king in Babylon, but for example, in their coins, even when they used different images for the Eastern mints, they really embraced Greek. And this was the Greek language, and they were not multilingual in the sense that the Achaemenids and apparently later also the Sasanians were. And so my question is, if we have with Shapur again the habit, the tradition of a trilingual inscription, doesn't this say something about the perception, the self-understanding of this empire in the Iranian tradition?
Thank you very much for your feedback, especially for the comments about the concept of reception, because currently I'm struggling a little bit with methodological issues, and I look forward to improve this aspect of my dissertation. Thank you. About your question, it's something about I haven't thought before, but now that you said that, I think that it's quite curious because, for example, the Achaimenid, in fact, did some inscriptions in different languages, like in Old Persian, of course, but also in Aramaic, also in Elamite, and it's quite curious that also the Arsakids had no problems in using Greek in inscriptions along Parthian and Middle Persian, and also the Sasanians used Parthian, Middle Persian, and Greek. And the exception, the striking, is the fact that the Greeks only used Greek. Well, it's quite curious. I don't know the reason, but in fact, it's noteworthy.
I think it says something about the self-understanding, despite this huge empire and despite all the efforts, to conquer the upper satrapies. It says something about, I mean, we know that the Seleukids, apart in opposition to the Ptolemies, they were part Iranian. I mean, they were not 100% just Greek speaking. So Antiochus first must have spoken languages of his and of some Eastern languages and everything. But the idea of the reign, was it's a one language empire. So I think this is a very, very distinctive feature, which of course betrays the Western origin somehow of this idea of kingship, I would say.
I completely agree. For example, you made me think about the fact that for example, the minor Iranian kingdoms of this time used to mint coins, imitating Seleucid coins, not only in iconography, but they even use Greek. And I think that one of the things that Seleucids did is create a context in which power may use Greek, and the Seleucids created this context in which power must be expressed in Greek, and for this reason, for example, these minor Iranian kingdoms use also Greek in their means. What I think is quite noteworthy. Yes, thank you very much.
Ben.
Yes, I'm very interested. First of all, thanks to both of you. This is a very high quality presentation and response, and thank you very much. I mean, this is exactly what we hope for in this lecture series. I'm interested in this discussion about historical consciousness in ancient history. And my question is really bibliographical. And sometimes there's just mistakes, right? There's just ignorance. And you've referred to that. So like in my neck of the woods, Jewish texts will mix up Assyrians and Medes and Persians, and Herodotus will mix things up. So that's ignorance and mistake. But sometimes it is polemical. Like Raúl had said, at least what I'd gotten from you before David responded about, okay, they left that out because that was Greek and not Iranian, if I understood you correctly. And even if that's not correct in that case, it is sometimes polemical and tendentious. My question is bibliographical. Is there a systematic study in the ancient world of accuracy and historical consciousness? Is there, with different contributions, from different areas?
Well, to be honest, I'm not completely aware of all these issues. But what I saw when I started to read bibliography is the fact that until the 20th century, or the end of the 20th century, most of the works about the Seleucid Empire had some kind of bias, and they tend to represent the Seleucid Empire only as a Greek empire in fact. And for example, that after the end of the 20th century, there was like the tendency to present the Seleucid as more Eastern Empire. Even I think that if I don't remember wrong, that in the book From Samarkand to Sardis of Sherwin White and Amelie Court, they propose that perhaps the real capital city of the Seleucid Empire was not Antioch, but was Seleucia on the Tigris. And in fact, I think that this kind of problems are quite we have to deal usually with this kind of problems.
I'm not aware of such a work either, that a work that Ben asked for, but that would be an interesting thing. And I'm looking into David's face because he is the universalist. So keep that in mind, please, David, if you come across something like that. That would be
so David, that does not exist. You understand what I'm asking,
right?
right?
I don't know. I have no knowledge.
I'm really asking. I'm asking David because he has that. No. But I think it is. What you're discussing is an interesting question. When is it polemical and tendentious, and when is it just ignorance and mistakes? And sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. And it would be interesting to see that. David, you're somebody who has that whole breadth. That's what Altai is saying. I think it would be interesting to look at that in some systematic way.
I mean, now it becomes, of course, a bit general, but it depends, of course, also on the propensity and the interest of different civilizations in phase of history itself. I mean, there are certain civilizations like the Chinese one, which is eminently historical. We have, even from the early empire, quite reliable sources describing dynasties 1,500 years before Then we have other civilizations like the Indian one, where basically the political history of classical India of the first millennium BC is more or less unknown to us, because there is no historiographical tradition proper in classical India, because it was never of any major interest. And so, I mean, if we look to Iranian history, we see, I think, 2 points. On the one hand, there is a relative absence of a proper historiographical tradition. So we have no information at all about any Iranian historiographer. We know, for example, people like Kautilya in India. We have Simachian in China. We even have Berosus, for example, and Manito for the Babylonian and Egyptian tradition and so forth, but we have no information at all about Iranian historiography. It only starts very late under Khosroes I, when he orders the compilation of this Book of Kings that is so contested. Was it just some anecdote? Was it proper historiography? Was it some form of dynastic historiography? Did it go back only to the Sasanians? Did it treat material before? Is this the real source of Tabari, for example? But this starts only extremely late, and we see something that is always so astonishing and surprising for me. I mean, the Parthians and the Sasanians, they often knew Greek. They had a lot of Greek citizens. They had cities that probably had very good libraries. So there must have been some copy of Herodot around somewhere in the Parthian or the Sasanian Empire. So whoever knew a little bit of Greek could reconstitute without big problems the entire history of the Achaemenid Empire. But obviously nobody did so. Nobody seems to have had that interest to reappropriate one's own political history by just reading a book of history in the Greek language. So that brings me to the second point, so that we can say on the one hand, okay, there is no historiographic tradition or interest in Iran, but at the same time, of course, we have a very strong oral tradition. And I would say that whatever Iran seems to be devoid of in terms of proper literary tradition, it tries to compensate that in terms of oral tradition. And of course, we know that oral tradition deforms a lot of stuff, which explains why the Shahmaneh is basically what it is, and why obviously what seemed most interesting to these oral traditions are the very early Iranian legends, but not necessarily historiographical sources, or rather that historiographical elements or political elements have then been deformed or deformated and been integrated somehow to fit in these semi-legendary archetypes. So I think that I think it would be a highly interesting subject to deal with that, but before examining, let's say, the historiographical traditions and what the absence of information means, because sometimes the absence is just the absence because something had been forgotten, but sometimes the absence is also a conscious ignorance or even rejection. But before we do that, we would really need to delve very deep into the mentality, mindset, and it is very obvious that from one, if we may use this word, from one civilization to the other, now it is very simplifying, the cultural collective approach towards the past can be radically different and remain so also.
You've just taken us deeper, right? I mean, it's really interesting. Now we're asking, why does one civilization have a historical consciousness, or when does one get one? I think these are fascinating questions.
I mean, just as a footnote to what Mrs. Meyer just said. So obviously the Sasanians must have been. I mean, they came from Persis. They were caretakers of the sanctuaries over there. they were caretakers from a certain point of view of the Achaemenid past, even though they probably didn't know at all what that meant. I suppose that very probably nobody in the Sasanian time must have been able to decipher any of these multilingual inscriptions they saw around. Basically, they probably just knew this is some old Iranian stuff. Somehow it's probably linked to the Kayanids. Probably that's how they interpreted that. And somehow they must have thought, okay, that looks nice. There are so many different scriptures on there that represents our universalist ideal. So let's do something similar. But probably they were absolutely unable to decipher whatever was written upon them. So it is a purely, I would say, formal overtaking that is, I think, due to the fact that they come from Persis, so they have this tradition and they want to put themselves into this form of visual continuity, which explains also why the Parthians, who never really felt very comfortable in Persis, for example, did not indulge into these multilingual things, and why also the Seleucids didn't do so. Why didn't they do so? It's a good question. Perhaps because already very soon the Frateraka dealt with that region, and that it was probably better for everyone that the Seleucids didn't continue their presence there after the memory of Alexander. I don't know. I have no idea. Purely hypothetical.
So, still many open questions after this stimulating presentation and exchange, but as Ben indicated, probably at a higher level henceforth. And Raúl, you already bridged in your talk to the upcoming Seleukid Study Day in Utrecht in November, just to mark your calendars, the 12th to the 15th November. We can expect some 25 presentations, and we hope that the program will soon go online. And I also announced the next lecture within this Seleukid lecture series. It is scheduled to be held by me on April the 16th, revisiting Seleukid foundation stories within the frameworks of colonial encounters and ethnicity constructs. And I look forward to receiving feedback from Professor Richard Wenghofer of Nipissing University. With this, I leave you to your afternoon or evening. Thank you for your participation and contribution, especially you, Raúl and David, once again. Thanks so much.